Hi, Notwestminster. Quixada Moore-Vissing here, and I want to talk with you about building local democracy. As I'm sure you're well aware, there are very real threats to both global and national democracy that can leave the average citizen wondering, what can I do? And I come from a school of thought that the way to strengthen global and national democracy is through focusing on local democracy. So it's the think global, act local mindset. And I want to share a framework for building local democracy that draws off of some experiences I've had in the research field over the past decade, looking at communities who are experimenting with public engagement, and in particular, a community called Pittsfield, which is located in rural New Hampshire. Pittsfield is a small town. It's a lower income community, also very close-knit community with a lot of people who've lived there for generations. And in 2005, it was deemed one of the lowest performing schools in the state of New Hampshire. There was very low community pride, and people even labeled it a dropout factory. The superintendent decided to work with the public institution, the University of New Hampshire, to engage in a comprehensive community engagement campaign that resulted in a new plan to revitalize the schools. And it made a huge amount of changes. If I had more time, I'd tell you all about it. But the bottom line is that the pride in the community dramatically increased. Educational outcomes became much stronger for students, and the Department of Education ended up recognizing Pittsfield as a model of school change. And I think that there are 5 lessons that I learned from communities like Pittsfield around how we can build local democracy that I wanted to share with you today. And the first one is that public institutions need to help communities to build their local capacity to engage the public. We can't assume that communities have that capacity, and so it needs to be cultivated and designed. The second lesson learned is that public servants and community leaders need training in public engagement principles and practices. And I think that there's often an assumption that just because you're a public servant, you know how to navigate divisive situations and you know how to be an equitable and participatory leader. And that's not necessarily the case. Most of the time, public officials receive very little training, if at all, around how to engage the public. And so we need to invest in this in our communities. The third piece of the framework for building local democracy is that we need to change our laws and policies to support better public engagement. I think we often get stuck in a rut where a policy has a very orchestrated way to engage the public, often very dry, not interesting to a lot of people, pretty confining in terms of the discourse that it allows. But because the policy says that, we feel like we have to hold public engagement processes in that way. Well, we can change the policies and update them to the modern world, and many communities are doing that. So that's the third piece of building a framework for local democracy. The fourth is that we have to address barriers to public engagement. Some of these barriers are logistical, and I think that we're pretty well aware of those as a field now, where we have to address things like childcare, transportation, when we hold meetings, where we hold meetings. But there's also an emotional component to barriers where if a community has been let down by public officials and decision makers for generations, they may be less likely to trust that this time their voice is going to matter. And so that trust has to be built. The fifth piece of the framework to building a local democracy is that public engagement needs to be sustained and consistent with multiple opportunities that allow people to get involved. So these might be things like public spaces, like a public park where people can easily intermix. It might be things like festivals, or, community dialogues, different opportunities for people to show up and engage, volunteerism, or it could be things like a tech app where maybe people don't have time to come to a community event, but they're happy to share their thoughts in a survey or online in an app. And I wanted to emphasize when we think about sustained, consistent public engagement opportunities, that we have to think about who is sustaining them. And I think oftentimes that we just rely on volunteerism, and then public engagement event work in a community ends up falling apart because that's just unpaid time and it's not sustainable. So one of my recommendations is that we embed public engagement in some of our public institutions and the way they work, like dedicated staffing, departments, resources in local government or in our public universities or other public institutions. So that's the 5-piece framework. So I wanted to just close with a thought, which is from a writer named Annie Dillard, a writer who I really like. And she wrote that how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. And I wanted to build off that and just say how we engage in our community every day is what makes our community what it is. So if we want a brighter future for our communities and for our local democracies, we have to invest in building this framework for local democracy. We have to invest in civic infrastructure. And that's what I wanted to leave you with today. Thank you so much.